I give the floor to Commissioner King, thanking him again for being here with us. Thank you, Commissioner. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for your invitation and the opportunity to come here today and have this exchange with you on what is, I entirely agree, a very important set of issues. I'm going to talk a little bit about internal security, but very much in the spirit of your introduction, the challenge of the intertwining of internal and external security. Security has long been regarded as a major, one of the key defining issues for national authorities, and that remains the case. But some other things have been changing and evolving more recently, and indeed that shift has coincided with this Commission that I'm proud to be part of. We're beginning to see how easily the terrorist threat, for example, crosses borders. No respect for national frontiers. There's a common terror threat from those inspired or trained by Daesh. They plot attacks targeting often public spaces where people visit from across Europe, indeed across the world. Their focus is on trying to target our values, the values we share as Europeans, of openness and tolerance. And we've seen, as their tactics evolve, with the emergence, although I don't like the term, of low-tech terrorism carried out with little more than a truck or a knife from Nice to Berlin to London to Barcelona, how present and very close to us, personal, that threat can be. But at the same time, we've also seen an evolution in cyber threats. Cyber attacks have struck now many different countries. We've seen major attacks such as earlier this year, the WannaCry attack. There's ongoing concern in many of our countries about cyber interference from outside. Often Russia is cited in this regard. And we've seen the potentially devastating impact of cyber attacks on aspects of our lives, our internal security, even raising questions about our democratic institutions themselves. And I think that faced with such cross-border, transnational threats, there's been a growing realization that common threats merit a common response, and that while no one is going to replace the role of national authorities in keeping their citizens safe and secure, there is more that can and indeed should be done at the European level to help and support those authorities in that work. And that's had an institutional implication. The Commission President, President Juncker, created for the first time a Commissioner for Security. The European Parliament has formed a new special committee on terrorism and the terrorism issues alongside the Libe Committee. Member States are cooperating ever more in tackling these threats. I'm not saying there isn't more we need to do, but they share increasingly law enforcement information with each other, and they cooperate between their different intelligence services as well, albeit not directly under the EU framework. Earlier this week, I had the privilege to speak to national parliaments in the COSAC plenary. And those representatives of national parliaments from across Europe were also very clearly aware and supportive of the need to work together to improve our collective security, offline and online. I think the EU can and should do more on these issues where it can add value. And today I'd like to touch briefly upon some of the ways in which I think the EU and cooperation at the European level in support of the Member States does add value. First, perhaps of course, we can use the power and scale of the single market, the institutions, the framework of our cooperation. Take cybersecurity, for example. All the new billions of devices coming online for the Internet of Things will need to demonstrate that they are secure. It's far easier for all concerned if manufacturers have to do that once rather than 27 different times. So last September, we in the Commission proposed an EU certification framework for ICT products and services. And I think Mr. Kalfin will be speaking more about this subject in a moment. Cooperation on research can also help us build digital investment, capability and security within the single market. We already have a public-private partnership on cybersecurity, and I think we need to build on that through a network of cybersecurity competence centres and with a new European cybersecurity research and competence hub at the centre of that activity. Second, we can do more to close down the space in which terrorists and others who seek to do us harm can act. We've already legislated, for example, to cut access to the firearms and explosives that have been used in some of these horrible terrorist attacks, to tackle money laundering, to criminalise those who travel to the Middle East for terrorist purposes, or those who help or train or fund people who are doing that. I think we need to continue to strengthen our response on these issues. Many recent attacks have used the homemade explosive TATP, which remains, unfortunately, a weapon of choice for Daesh. And in spite of existing EU legislation in this area, it's obviously still too easy for attackers to get their hands on the substances they use to make that explosive. So we're reviewing the EU legislation on so-called explosive precursors. And ahead of that review, we've already set out a recommendation with immediate steps Member States can take to prevent the misuse of those substances and tighten the controls. We're clamping down on terrorist financing. We've already largely implemented the 2016 Action Plan on terrorist financing, but we still need to make it easier for law enforcement to get access to financial information held in another country, which can be a big issue in terrorism and indeed serious criminal investigations. So we're going to continue to work with the national authorities to make sure that they have the tools that they need. Third, and I think this is often undervalued, we can share experience and best practice across European partners. Authorities in many of our countries are seeing similar trends, facing similar problems, asking similar questions. And I think we can learn from each other's experience and expertise. We're seeing a common and mounting threat of terrorist attacks against public spaces, as I said. City squares, tourist sites, sporting venues. We're, in the centre, going to provide guidance about some of the lessons that have been learned from across Europe on best ways to protect those public spaces without changing their fundamentally open character. And we're going to encourage cooperation between authorities, national, regional and local, in taking steps to protect those public spaces, and indeed we're going to mobilise some funding to support that. Many European countries are also asking themselves similar questions about how best to tackle the challenge of radicalisation. What drives people, in many cases citizens of our own countries, to embrace such poisonous ideology and go down the route of violence? I think many of us were taken back, surprised by the number of people from Europe who travelled to Iraq or Syria to fight for Daesh. The number of Europeans who've been inspired to violent acts of murder by Daesh propaganda that they've seen often online. So across our countries, people are asking these questions. How can frontline workers like teachers, social workers or prison staff spot the warning signs? What is the role of policymakers, practitioners, researchers? How do they work together in a common effort? How can civil society get better at spreading an alternative message for those who might be tempted down the route of violence. Now, some of the solutions are going to lie in government policies, but others are properly dealt with by local authorities or indeed by civil society, schools, youth clubs, social services. And I think there's a question which we need to address about how those different groups, policymakers and practitioners, can best work together. And we have networks at the European level that can help address some of these issues. We set up a high-level expert group on radicalisation a little while ago that's just issued its interim report and is going to be taking forward work on all of these issues, bringing together government and civil society. We've got the Radicalisation Awareness Network that many of you, I hope, have heard of, which continues to provide support and guidance to those on the front line, teachers, probation officers and others who are grappling with these issues. And we're working directly with the big internet companies to tackle this question of terrorist propaganda online, to try and make sure, if we can, that it never gets online, or if it does, that it's taken down effectively immediately. And we've been clear that we want to continue to make progress on a voluntary basis, if we can, because that's the most effective way of making rapid progress, but that we reserve the right to legislate if necessary and if those voluntary measures are not going far enough, fast enough. Beyond sharing experience, we can also share information about specific threats and people who wish us harm. In the terror attacks we've seen, sometimes the suspects have travelled between our countries, between member states. Sometimes they've been known to the authorities in one member state, but not in another. Sometimes they've even registered with different identities in different countries. And I think we need to get better at closing these gaps in our information picture and information sharing. We already have some measures that are very helpful. You will all be familiar with the information sharing around airline passengers, PNR, which can, I think, really help to detect and prevent not only terrorism but serious and organised crime. But we have to put those things that we've agreed into practice. And on PNR in particular, I am working with the few remaining member states who have not yet done what they agreed to do in time to get this system up and working by the deadline we've all set of May next year. We have existing EU databases to help police, border guards, judicial authorities to share information, to support each other in their work. And more and more, those databases are being used. They're proving their usefulness, and they're being used more by the member states. If you take perhaps the largest, perhaps the best well-known of those databases, the Schengen Information System, the amount of information that was shared across that system by member states went up 40% in 1 year last year. And, of course, if the police in one country want to talk to a particular individual and that individual is detected by authorities elsewhere using something like the Schengen Information System, he can be stopped, if necessary, picked up, and in that way, national authorities in one country can effectively get the support of authorities across 27 others. But we need to get better at how we use this kind of information that's shared across these databases. It's something I hear, it's a challenge that I hear regularly, and it's entirely justified. But the flip side of it is also that we need to make it easier for law enforcement and the others who are working on to keep us safe to actually have the information they need to do their jobs. Not necessarily by gathering whole new piles of data or by creating endless new databases or merging everything into one great database, which I sometimes hear people talk about, but first and foremost, by better using the information we already have available. Currently, police or the authorities have access, as I said, on occasion to an incomplete picture. The Berlin attacker was able to have separate identities in different countries. I think we need to take action now to try and address those gaps in our systems. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to come forward with proposals to make our existing databases and proposed databases interoperable. It's a big word. What it means is that we want those databases to be able to work effectively together. A European search portal will help frontline police and customs officers access different EU information systems at the same time, getting combined results in one single screen. A shared biometric matching service for fingerprints will mean authorities can search all the systems that they have access rights for at a single click of a button. And a common identity repository will store the core identity data, such as names, dates of birth, gender, underpinning all of our systems, to deal with this question of individuals trying to use multiple identities. By better use of the data we already have, we can enhance our security, protect our borders, and help national authorities to do their job. Next year, we'll look at what other information might help law enforcement in their work, such as financial information or electronic evidence for crimes that have been committed online or have an important online element. So these are some of the ways in which we, I think, can add value to our collective security across Europe. But of course, there's also, as the Chair said, an important international dimension to all of this. If there's one thing these new security threats have in common, it's that they cross borders. Not only national borders, not only European borders, but international borders. Also, policy borders. They straddle and test the boundaries of our different policies, internal and external, military and civilian. Things that happen overseas increasingly have very direct security impacts in our own countries. Born from a conflict in the Middle East, Daesh invites European citizens to go and fight in Syria. Its propaganda, often spread online, incites people at home, in their communities, to commit acts of terror in our different countries. Conditions in North Africa and Turkey have a direct impact on migration flows into and across the EU. Cyber attacks plotted from beyond our borders impact on our critical infrastructure and, as I said, sometimes on our democratic institutions. As such, our external action has a direct impact not just on our partners and allies, but for our own citizens and their security. We need to maintain and strengthen our joint work on counterterrorism with Middle East, North Africa, Western Balkans, Turkey, to name just some. Agencies traditionally associated with internal security policies, like Europol or the Border and Coast Guards, also need to cooperate more with those associated with common defence and security policy. We're going to be proposing soon that Europol work more closely in sharing information with agencies from a host of North African and Middle Eastern countries to enable each party, each authority, to more effectively tackle terrorism and serious crime. We're also giving new and substantial impetus to the EU-NATO partnership after the agreement reached last year, well known to you. We are different organisations, but with many of the same goals, but large part the same membership. And against some of these threats, I think it's absolutely essential that we need to work together. We're working together already in practical and operational ways through joint exercises, in counter-terrorism, but also in areas such as cyber and hybrid threats. Of course, we now also have greater military cooperation among our member states within the framework of the EU itself, after a long and sometimes painful evolution, through permanent structured cooperation and the newly proposed European Defence Fund. And I'm sure Mr. Gahler will go into some more detail on those issues. Pooling some capability and working together makes, I think, economic and efficiency sense, but also strategic sense. That 23 member states signed up by their own free will to PESCO a few days ago shows that they also see the advantages in such cooperation. So the security threats we face are not going to go away. Cyber threats are, I'm afraid, here to stay. While we're making progress on the ground in Iraq and now Syria against Daesh, I don't think they're going to go away either, sadly. I'd like to be able to say that we can reduce some of these risks to zero, that we can eliminate some of these risks. But I think that's a misleading thing to try and set as an ambition. And I'm not sure it helps try and set that out as an ambition if we're going to build the credibility of the work that we're doing. What we can do, and what we are doing, is work together effectively to cut the risk, to cut the threat surface, to cut the means attackers have available to do us harm. We do that best when we work together. Thank you. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Commissioner, for this comprehensive approach to this such an important challenge. And now we open the floor for questions and answers. Who would like to begin? Please. Yeah, you have the floor, Malon. Yeah. Merci. Beaupuy, après. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I note the Commissioner made reference to the ever more cooperating of Member States of the European Union. I think he will not be surprised when I ask the very obvious question related to a country we are both familiar with, which may leave, I hope not, the European Union. During the referendum in my country, security was pretty well put at the top of all the official documentation advocating Britain should stay in the European Union by the government. Indeed, it's probably fair to say we are the leader in the European Union on security, and with France, we are the leaders in defence. So I really ask what is going to happen. I see very little mention of any discussion on this aspect. My own view is that it would be a weakness, whether we're in or out, that Britain is not in the regular meetings of foreign ministers, particularly when security is concerned. So if we are cooperating more, are we going to ensure that will continue, rather than the case of my country, but I would think to the benefit of the whole European Union on security? And I should explain, I live outside of Cheltenham, in other words, which is the security centre. So I get it every day. I would love to hear a comment.
Thank you, Robert. Do you want to answer, or I take more questions?
Whichever you want. Whichever way you want.
Well,
it's not a surprise we get a question about Brexit. Sometimes it comes at the beginning, sometimes it comes at the end, but it definitely comes, and I shall deal with it. But
okay.
Well, that's what it's like for me every day, I assure you.
Yeah. Well, this is about the country you are familiar with. Yeah. Yeah. But we. Yeah. And then, yeah.
Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Commissaire,
Chairman, Commissioner, we greatly welcome that presentation where you've described what is being done and what should be done. Now, for former members and for our citizens, we would like barriers to be removed as quickly as possible. Now, barriers to this cooperation. There are financial obstacles, but also technical obstacles such as synchronization of computer systems, but also political barriers. Could you, Commissioner, very briefly and clearly say what you think the most immediate obstacles are to be raised to improve and intensify our cooperation properly?
Merci, Monsieur le Commissaire.
Thank you, Commissioner. We sometimes forget that before the European Union there was the Council of Europe, and we set up the WEU with 12 countries having mutual control on production and sales of arms. This was abolished a few years ago. Does the European Commission, in its efforts to guarantee security, think about this question of production and sales of arms?
Micavaldi, followed by Valero.
Grazie.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, you may speak Italian. Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner, thank you for your introduction and particularly for your conclusion that we should work together and coordinate as far as possible. The High Representative Federica Mogherini has variously talked about preventive diplomacy, a common strategy for diplomacy rather than simple coordination. Here, it's very important to understand whether we have a common strategy for migration policy, because we have seen that many of the problems arising with Italy at the moment are due to migrant flows and so on. So the question about a common strategy, and then obviously I would be interested in your ideas for post-Brexit as to whether the UK will be involved in coordination, but basically our view is that we need strong intelligence coordination within the European Union, and it's vital to have this within the Atlantic Alliance as well, with the United States and with Latin America. Thank you.
Followed by
Thank you, President, and thank you, Commissioner, for this very enlightening presentation. Indeed, we all advocate better synchronization of information systems across the European countries and perhaps even further out. Because of cyber threats and because of requirements for information, I remember a debate in OECD where they dealt with cybersecurity. At that time I was attending those meetings, and there were in particular representatives of Israel, where the cybersecurity and the ability to manage data networks is worldwide recognized, and their concern was that there must be some sort of balance between a very energetic data control and privacy and respect of, citizens' private life. I wonder if this concern is at all present in your discussions, or it is, far away from your concern. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for your engagement on these issues. I hope we're encouraging a round of questions from some of the student participants as well. I'm not quite sure what the rules are on this, but if anyone wants to ask a question from further back in the room, I'd be very happy to try and address those as well. On the elephant that occasionally gets into the room of Brexit, I'm not in charge of the Brexit negotiations. As you know, Michel Barnier does that for the Commission. I don't work for HMG anymore. I'm proud to have sworn my oath in front of the Court of Justice and serve in the College of Commissioners. So I haven't got a formal position from which to talk about Brexit, but people do occasionally ask me, and when they do, I say that on these issues, the issues concerned with security, I very much welcome the fact that both sides, if that's the right terminology, HMG on one part and the remaining 27 on the other, have now said clearly and unambiguously that they think that cooperation in this field should proceed unconditionally. Mm-hmm. Now, we'll see exactly what that means in practice, but I take that to mean that everybody involved clearly understands that they have a self-interest but a shared self-interest in finding ways of maintaining the closest possible cooperation after the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union. And that, I think, is logical given the nature of the threats that we're talking about. Because something is a shared objective and perhaps accepted by everybody as a good idea, doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be easy to do in practice. And if and when we get to that part of this process that is talking about the future relationship, I've said on a number of occasions, I hope that the discussion on security issues can start early, because I think they're very, very important, as you say. I do hope that we will be able to make rapid progress, and that might even help build some momentum for some other aspects of discussions on the future relationship, which are undoubtedly going to be quite difficult. But in saying that, I don't want to give the impression that it's all going to be entirely straightforward to sort out the practical arrangements for maintaining close cooperation on these issues. I think there will be issues. There may be some issues around financing, but there will definitely be organisational and political issues that we will have to work through together if we are going to achieve this shared objective of finding structures within which close and effective cooperation can exist and continue to evolve, because the threats themselves will continue to evolve. So that's, I hope, some help to you in at least framing the discussion that we will have to take forward when we get to that stage of the process. I try as hard as I can not to practice a langue de bois before you or indeed any other audience. There are some political issues that still need to be worked through in this area. These are subjects that are very close to national authorities' hearts. A number of these subjects, traditionally, as you know very well, have been foundation stones of people's perception of their sovereignty and their sovereign responsibilities. But what's changed, and what I was trying to point towards, is that the nature of the threats has obliged people to understand the benefits of cooperating. It doesn't matter how good you are at this stuff, and this actually applies a little bit in answer to the first question as well. It doesn't matter how good you are at this stuff, you are better when you work together. And that practical consideration, if you like, that self-interested practical consideration, has led member states to want to cooperate more in this area. And at least for the moment, cooperation in this area is not caught up in debates around subsidiarity and responsibility. No one is suggesting in Brussels that somehow Brussels is going to replace the member states' authorities for these core security issues, but we are saying, and the member states are supporting through their actions, that there are things that we can do together at a European level to help and support. And I think that needs to be pursued, and we need to continue to develop that debate. It's by showing that we're useful and that support makes a practical difference that you will increase the amount of national engagement. And I think that's true on information sharing, coming to some of the subsequent questions. I think that's true on information sharing. It's true on the use of data. And it's also true on intelligence. Why do I make a distinction between those three different things? Because I think they're sometimes conflated together. And people talk about the need to share information, barriers to sharing information. Personally, I think it helps me at least, to make a distinction between different sorts of information, because they present different challenges. There's a large amount of information that is being shared. We still need to do more, and we need to plug some of the gaps, as I explained, which is law enforcement type of information about suspects, about threats, which is exchanged across shared EU databases where there are privacy protections, data protections, but there's a large amount of sharing. And I think that's very positive, and it's proving its practical benefits. There is a certain amount of information that is source-sensitive intelligence information, slightly different category. I'm very glad to say that there is a good cooperation amongst the intelligence services across Europe, working together on a daily basis in a headquarters that they've set up together near The Hague in the Netherlands, where they work practically using the information that they bring to that cooperation. But it needs a different kind of handling and a different kind of protection from the first category of information that I mentioned that can be shared across these EU-wide databases. Then, and this is in answer to the gentleman down here, there is a debate which is continuing to evolve about how we share and use data more widely, in particular in support of our security objectives. And there are some big challenges. We have, and I think we're rightly proud of, very high standards of data protection in our countries and in the EU, both of personal data, privacy, confidentiality. And we need to find ways, consistent with those very high standards, in no way undermining those high standards, of using data and data analysis effectively in support of our security, our collective security. That debate, again, a slightly different set of issues, is one that you ask, do we spend time on that? We spend a lot of time on that, and it's crucial that we get it right. Migration. Migration is dealt with primarily by one of my colleagues, as you know, Dimitris Avramopoulos, who's been working very hard to, against a background which I think we can all recognise has been very difficult, to reinforce cooperation in this area. He's been very clear about the importance of our supporting, in particular, those countries that find themselves on the front line, Greece, Italy, some others. And I think that we have got better at offering support, although I know that the debate and the criticism has been quite strong on occasion in Italy and in Greece. And we are still now grappling with the consequences of that large wave of migration that we experienced, in particular last year. We have taken some practical steps, I think, that have reduced the flows, and we are building gradually greater cooperation around, for example, returning people who are failed asylum seekers. But I don't want to diminish the challenge that remains. I will just say on the question of migration in the context of a discussion on security, which is our subject today, that I think it's very, very important that we maintain the distinction between migration and the problems that are posed by migration flows on the one hand and security concerns on the other. Because if you conflate those two issues, you're doing Daesh's work for them. It's Daesh who want to encourage the idea that all migration is somehow a security threat, that anyone who is a migrant is somehow a security threat. And I think we shouldn't help them to do that. We should do everything we can to push back against that, in my view, mistaken narrative. But that doesn't mean we should be naive. There are some people who wish us harm, some terrorists, who have sought to use migration routes to come back into Europe. And that's why I think it's been so important that we've taken practical steps to reinforce our knowledge base, our controls at external frontiers, not closing them, but knowing more about who's coming in and out, and the information exchange between our law enforcement and security authorities within our shared space, to help break that conflation. The WEU, I spent a number of years when I was a younger diplomat working on issues connected with the WEU. In some ways, I think a late and lamented organisation. Some of the ideas that are now being taken forward in the context of European cooperation, the Defence Fund, particularly the PESCO cooperation, is inspired by elements that were in those first treaties, inspired by some of the cooperation that the WEU sought to take forward while it was in existence. We certainly, but it also has to evolve. It also has to take account of the new threats that we face. So we are certainly very keen to encourage investment, particularly investment in research, that is going to address these new security concerns, both real world and the cyber security concerns, which is why we're putting such a lot of effort into organising our research on cybersecurity, which I mentioned. And the Defence Fund and PESCO should be drivers of capability building for tackling these future threats. The question of arms sales is, as I'm sure you know, a slightly different set of issues. It isn't that it's ducked in the context particularly of sanctions and difficult relations with some third countries. It is discussed, but it's not something on which we have a general policy. I hope that helps. Cooperation with third countries. I think cooperation with third countries is vitally important on all of these issues. You, Sir, mentioned Israel and cyber as one example. In fact, there's a whole network of cooperation that we have, in particular with our near neighbours, on countering terrorism, countering radicalisation, where I think there's a lot we can learn from some of our neighbours, and increasingly, although it was slower to start, on cooperation on tackling cyber threats. Now, two things. One, in pursuing that cooperation, we have to do it on a basis that is firmly rooted in the values that we're seeking to protect. All our policies in these areas, our security policies in these areas, need to reflect the fundamental values that we are protecting. And that is true for our cooperation with third countries as well. But I'm glad to say that we did a survey the other day of EU policies connected to security, where we had an external dimension. And we identified some €2 billion worth of projects last year with third countries, particularly near neighbour partners, that were contributing to their security and their security capacities and to ours at the same time.
Thank you, Commissioner, for being here with us. And, good luck. And this is a big challenge that you face for all of us, working together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.